Jesus Revolution, the new faith-based film based on the true story about the Jesus movement that began in 1960s California. That is well-intentioned and gets some elements right, but ultimately feels too uneven. The film stars Joel Courtney as Greg Laurie, a wandering teenager who is searching for something but doesn't know what. So he dives headfirst into the hippie lifestyle. After one really bad night, he comes across a charismatic street preacher named Lonnie Frisbee, played by Jonathan Roumie, who had recently become friends with a previously stuffy, judgmental pastor, Chuck Smith, played by Kelsey Grammer, who has begun opening his church to the lost hippie generation, who are also seeking some kind of meaning in their life, but little do any of them know that this one act is going to lead to a massive revival that sweeps the nation, beyond anything that any of them could have ever dreamed of. Strap yourselves in, because I have a lot to say about this one. One of the things that kind of bothered me throughout most of this film was that the entire experience just felt uneven. This film has more or less 3 different plots: Greg Laurie's conversion to Christianity and his romance with Kathy, Pastor Chuck Smith learning to overcome his prejudice to hippies and opening his church to them, and the hippie-turned-street pastor Lonnie, who lets the fame that he gets from the revival get to his head. And even though all of these were stories that happened at the same time in real life, they don't really complement each other here within the confines of this narrative, and the film has a difficult time juggling them. Characters will kind of disappear as the story progresses. Kelsey Grammer as Chuck Smith is really underutilized. He winds up disappearing for like 20 to 30 minutes at one point. His wife and daughter get it even worse, vanishing for almost an hour before coming back near the end to have one final talk with him. That, I think, is a natural byproduct of this film just biting off a little bit more than it can chew. There are so many plots and subplots, so many different characters who each have to have their own arcs that progress at different times, so it's perhaps inevitable that some of these would get lost in the shuffle. The other thing holding this film back is that it violates show don't tell a lot. Now, some of that is because of the target audience that this is aimed at. This film wants to be something that can be shown in churches, so the more unsavory elements of the hippie movement, particularly their drug abuse, have to, by necessity, be toned down. The film tries to have a couple of scenes showcasing how drugs are bad, but honestly, it's just so mild that it barely registers. Now, granted, that may be unfair because I've seen films like Requiem for a Dream or Climax, films that go hard in showcasing just how damaging a drug conviction can be, that this feels tame by comparison, but putting that aside as much as I can, it still feels so sterile. For instance, in real life, Greg Laurie had a really bad LSD episode where he looked in the mirror and his face began to melt away, revealing the skull behind his eye. And it was that bad trip that made him want to leave drugs behind. It could have been a nice, potent image that really left an impression and been used to symbolically illustrate that the drugs were stripping him of his identity. But instead, the film just changes it to him seeing the word die being written on a car window. And that's not nearly as impactful. I'm not saying the filmmakers are obligated to follow what actually happened and potentially lessen the broad appeal that they're trying to reach, but what I am saying is that it makes the product less memorable. It makes it less interesting. Such a scene would have really helped it stand out, and it would have more powerfully shown what the drugs were doing to him. What they chose to do gets the job done, but they could have gone further with it. The film just feels so sanitized and safe, almost like it's afraid of offending anyone, secular or Christian. Lonnie's struggles with homosexuality and the fact that he died from an AIDS-related illness are not brought up. Again, likely to avoid offending people on both sides of the aisle. The closest I can see to this film actually making something of a stand, barring the actual gospel message, is that it does lightly chastise those who partake in faith healing and being overly theatrical. But again, it doesn't really go into specifics about why those things might be bad. It just gives the impression that it's supposed to be bad. So yeah, this sounds like typical watered down Christian cinema, right? Well, Kind of. Truth be told, there are some things about it that I really liked. There are more than a few scenes where the movie clicks and does a good job. There was a wonderful scene where, after being told that the hippies are ruining the church carpet with their bare feet, the pastor offers to wash their feet before they enter, which is kind of a nice bit of symbolism that draws parallels from John 13, where Jesus washes the disciples' feet. And that was something that didn't need to be explained to the audience. It let them make that connection all on their own. There's another where a church service gets interrupted by a man in a wheelchair who is clearly suffering from the after effects of a bad drug episode, and the congregation stops the service to gather around him to pray. Again, it's a nice moment that shows, without explaining with words, that sometimes a church service can deviate in an unexpected and powerful way, and that's okay. The film is for the most part shot well, which is a credit to both the film's directors John Irwin and Brent McCorkle. One thing that's always impressed me about John Irwin as a director in particular is that he knows how to frame his shots. His films look professional, and this is no exception. They even managed to perfectly capture the time period of the 60s. Something they did so effortlessly that I was never, even for a second, snapped out of the illusion. That is impressive and definitely worth giving props to. The performances are also pretty good. Kelsey Grammer is a nice presence as Pastor Smith, but by far the standout performance is Jonathan Roumie as Lonnie. This actor does a great job embodying the man's passion for Jesus and some of his more bizarre habits without turning him into a stereotype. And I did enjoy some of what this film was trying to accomplish. I think the story of Pastor Smith in particular is really interesting as he tries his best to welcome people into his church that, by all accounts, the rest of his congregation thinks are weirdos, and the resulting culture clash that follows because of it. This film does at least go out of its way to showcase that even people who are Christians can indeed be flawed individuals, and sometimes their visions about what needs to be done to preach or spread the gospel can conflict. So it was nice that the film acknowledges that. So overall, I think it's fair to say this one's more of a mixed bag rather than it being either good or bad. If you want my opinion about how to fix this so that it would be better, this should have been a miniseries. The 3 concurrent plots are compelling enough on their own that they could each sustain an episode of approximately an hour in length. I also would have gone a little bit harder with the material. This is a historical film, so there are certain not PG-13 things that really happened that I think needed to be explored further in order for the audience to really, truly see the transformation and revival that took place. But yeah, like I said, by doing that, the film would alienate their core audience. So, in that regard, they were basically stuck between a rock and a hard place. This is a film whose primary audience is people who are already Christian. There is no getting around that. Which, if that's what you want to do, is fine. I'm not disparaging that at all. There is an audience for this kind of film. And if you're the target audience and you like it, that's great. I understand the appeal. But that also means that if you put it out in theaters, I'm going to tell you how I think it succeeds and fails as a film, because that's what it is. I'm not going to dismiss this film outright, because it is by no means an awful or even bad film. And if it manages to have some kind of positive effect, then who am I to stand in its way? I just think that by going the safe route, it doesn't really go beyond the surface level of what should be a really rich and interesting true story. Jesus Revolution gets a half-empty shot. That review you just heard was an excerpt from my weekly review show This Weekend, where I review 5 brand new movies every single weekend. If you would like to check that out, then make sure that you subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss it. And as always, if you want to see more of my reviews, you can check out my Letterboxd account. The link is in the description below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.